I'd like to start with a question for you all. How would you feel if somebody called you a loser? It would probably feel a little sting, a little like, okay, what's up with you? But what if everyone in the classroom got up and started pointing at you and saying, loser, loser, loser? Like, imagine like a basketball game, people start doing something like that. It'd probably be kind of unnerving. But what if you went online and you went viral and there was a meme and suddenly not just tens of people but thousands of people, maybe millions of people were up there commenting on what a complete and total loser you are? If you're like a normal person, that would probably be pretty devastating. And it's an interesting question because it's just one word. Yet it has such enormous power over us. And we can think of any number of words that have power over us. And why? Why is that? Why do other people's opinions, why do other people's judgments, why do their statements matter so much to us? And to answer that question, we need to go to this. We're up to the fourth layer of the self here. Now, as I've said before, we started our self process at our core with the cellular self that's there resisting entropy, perpetuating the life force. Nestled around this and elaborating on this is this animal self. And the animal self is there generating maps of reality and making predictions so all of its cellular components can work together as one to make their way through the world. Last week we talked about the linguistic self, which is distinctive to us as human beings. It's the words, concepts, tools, technologies, laws, morals that we use to try to order ourselves socially and expand our self processes so they're working as a collective, but also internalizing them into ourselves as well. And now we're up to the egoistic self. And the egoistic self is basically all of those self processes that are helping us negotiate with other people. It's all the parts of ourselves that are interfacing in our social worlds. Now, when we start talking about the ego, we oftentimes conflate that with our full selves. It's easy to think that, oh, here I am, ego, me, I, and this is who I am. This is my full self. I mean, think about like the terms like me, myself. These are egoistic concepts that we said before. They're the individual repository of all of our traits, our identities, our characteristics. So it's very, very easy to kind of conflate and confuse our ego with our full self. But as you've been seeing so far in this class, the ego is not our full self. It's only a part of ourselves. In some ways, it's like this veneer, this kind of crust that emerges on top of this roiling stew of energy and animalism and culture. And the ego is usually what makes itself available to us in terms of our conscious perception. And so we think the ego is all there is. I think there's a really good quote for this that I like from a guy named Richard Alport. He was a psychologist, and then he later had a spiritual transformation and renamed himself Baba Ram Das. Here he says, the ego is not who you really are. The ego is your self-image. It is your social mask. It is the role you are playing. Your social mask thrives on approval. It wants control. It is sustained by power because it lives in fear. What I want to do today is I want to talk about the ego. And I want to talk about this egoistic part of ourselves. And the ego now is something of a nebulous concept. It's actually a pretty recent invention in English. If you go back and look at any English writings prior to the 1900s, you won't really see it unless somebody is quoting Latin. That's because the term ego is a Latin term. It means I. We think of it something like my ego was bruised or someone's being egotistical. Oftentimes, though, we don't necessarily have a clear understanding of what the ego is. So when I'm going to describe the ego, what I'm going to be talking about are this collection of psychological processes that we use to negotiate with others. It's all of the things that we utilize in terms of our own internal processes to figure out what we need and how we get what we want from those around us. At its very surface, we can say the ego has certain kinds of propensities to it. For example, I think the ego is the defender of our entitlements. We expect others to treat us with a certain amount of dignity and respect based on our social position. We have individual rights. We assert those individual rights. And the ego is what is there defending that for us, defending those prerogatives. And think about it, if those rights get trampled on, if some people disrespect us, if they don't adhere to our entitlements, we get upset, we get motivated to act. That's all part of the ego. The ego is also a hoarder of status. If you think about, yes, we all want to be treated equal at some level, but we also think of ourselves as special. We want to get certain extra things from other people. We want to have certain privileges bestowed onto us. And so we work hard at certain kinds of things in life. You know, we go for a certain kind of career, we go for a certain kind of accomplishment, and we want the rewards and accolades that come from those achievements. And why? That is feeding this ego. It's feeding this idea of ourselves as special. The other thing I would say about the ego is that it's a sponge of adoration. We utilize our egos because it reflects this infantile longing to be loved by everyone. Think about how when you were brought up, if you were lucky, your parents probably told you how special you were, how remarkable you as an individual was. So in this way, the ego is it's not just a mechanism that we use to interact with other people. It's something more. It's a repository of affect. It's laden with feelings. And a good way to think about this is consider a $100 bill. Okay, $100 bill here is just a piece of paper. It has value in terms of we can exchange it for certain kinds of goods and services. And so it has a utility in and of itself. But if I put the $100 bill here down, it's more than just a piece of paper on the ground. If you see money on the ground, it's hard not to put your eyes on it. It has a certain resonance there. There's a potential in its emotional consequences. And that's kind of how the ego is for us too. The ego is not simply just this set of processes, it's a set of processes that are emotionally laden. But the problem is we don't know that the ego as such exists. It's not something that we can necessarily verify scientifically. I'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks, of where in the brain the ego might reside. But we don't really know our ego in the typical scientific way that we know other aspects of ourselves. Instead, the way we know our ego is typically through our stories. If you want to know what are all the psychological processes that you're using to negotiate with other people, and particularly those processes that are particular and distinct to you, you need to go and look at your stories. And you could think about your stories, the daily events and the daily activities of your life, your successes and failures, of each moment. And then those stories get woven into a larger story and narrative about your life and your life trajectory. And then perhaps this larger narrative of your life trajectory gets interwoven into a grander cosmic narrative about what your place in the universe is supposed to be. And all of this then really centers around your ego, and the way you know all these things is through stories. So what I want to do today is talk about how we can know our ego at sort of a deeper level. How do we know our stories, and how do we know what's going on behind our stories? And I want to start by going back to our early hominid ancestor here. So take an early Homo sapiens. We met this guy last week, probably lived around 200,000 years ago. And as I was describing, he lived in probably an alpha hierarchical situation. It was a troop of humans living together. There were alphas and there were betas. And, let's call this guy Adam. Adam probably had a rudimentary ego. He always was understanding what his position in the troop was. He was always kind of looking around and seeing who was gaining in strength, who was weakening in strength. Where might he act to gain some advantageous position in terms of his place in the pecking order? So yes, he did have an ego, but it was an ego that was always bound to the moment. He kind of knew himself in not a dissimilar way to the way, say, your dog might know themselves. They always know themselves in immediate relationship to those people who are around. And if they're not around other members of their pack or their troop, they're probably focusing on something else. They're probably not necessarily ruminating so heavily on themselves because they don't really have a way to conceptualize themselves. They don't have language. Let's fast forward. So let's go to say 40,000 years ago. We have our fully domesticated human ancestor here. They're a lot more neotenous, a lot cuter. They're a lot more gracile. They have language. They're organizing themselves around this linguistic self. They have rules, they have morals, they have a way of, a set of ideas that put the tribe together. And they're fully domesticated. They're also really defined by myth and culture. The way that they're understanding themselves and the way that they're understanding their egos is by the stories they tell. As I said before, if you go and look at mythic cultures, people in these cultures really are defined by know thy place. They are defined by what their role is in the tribe. So you're a mother, or you're a hunter, or you're a son, or you're a daughter, or you're a shaman. You have a very, very specified role for you in terms of who you are. And that's how you know yourself. Yes, you have a name. You might have some individual qualities to you. Sure, those are always bubbling out. But the primary way that you know yourself is in relationship to your role in the tribe. And how do you know yourself in relationship to that role in the tribe? Through your myths and stories. If you go to these kind of early pre-literate mythic cultures, they are constantly telling stories of the tribe and what it means to be a hunter or a mother or a father. These are the things that inform them, their sense of self. They don't really have a terrific sense of individuality. It's much more embedded within this larger cultural narrative that the tribe uses to sustain itself. Sort of who's writing their life story, if you ask them? Well, the tribe is, my culture is. They wouldn't even say it that way. It would be kind of nonsensical. My story is pre-written. The gods wrote my life story for me. I am sort of just living out according to their dictates. And this goes to, I think, a really important thing about our species. We are natural storytellers. In some ways, I think it would be more appropriate to call our species Homo fabalans, which means, storyteller, than Homo sapiens, which is wise human. Our cognition, our sense of orientation, and our self is really, really based around stories. And I want to give an example. And Sophia, this goes back to a point that you made last week. Yes, our species is probably naturally oriented towards being hierarchical in our social organizations. But if you go and you look around a lot of mythic cultures, particularly those that are foraging cultures, that are pre-agricultural, they tend to be pretty egalitarian. And the anthropologist Christopher Boehm has a really interesting idea around this. And he says that this is the result of a reverse dominance hierarchy. Basically, in these kinds of societies, they start using stories to keep everybody in line. They use stories to monitor each other. If someone starts, agitating for too much power, they use stories to try to keep that person back in check. They're actually pretty egalitarian, but it depends upon a relentless effort on their part to sustain that egalitarianism. And if you live in a foraging society where you can't necessarily accumulate a lot of food and capital, this kind of process generally works. Once you move to agriculture and once you can begin to store foodstuffs, you see kind of a reversal back to a more hierarchical form of social organization. But the way this kind of reverse dominance hierarchy is basically sustained, it's through gossip. And think about it, we all have a natural appetite for gossip. It's why, these kind of magazines are so appealing for us. We all want to know what's going on with other people. We all want to trade information about other people, and we typically want to do it in a way that brings people kind of more in line with us in an egalitarian scale. This is how the ego works. So, who do we want to gossip about primarily? We want to gossip about famous, important people who have high status. And what are we most interested in terms of gossiping about them? Their foibles, their failures. Or we want to gossip about the people we know. We want to gossip about our family and friends. And what do we want to gossip about them? Typically their failures and foibles. Yes, we want to celebrate their successes with them sometimes. And I can see this, like, my wife and I have had a set of friends for 25 years. The people we just love most in the world, and just love spending time with them. They're just delightful. And we'll go to a dinner party with them, and we'll all get together and we'll have a great time. And then we're on our way home, we're driving. And then inevitably we'll be like, can you believe Paul did that? And then, then these are the people we love most. And there's this, inevitable gossiping about them and kind of wiggling into all of their weaknesses, or can't believe that they did this, or wow, they're really in trouble about this. And My friends do it to us too. This is what everybody does. It's this natural tendency, and I think it goes back to this wanting to pull everyone back together towards some sort of reverse dominance hierarchy, wanting to keep everyone in kind of check. And this is a big role that our stories do for us. When we are gossiping, we are actually telling stories here, and we're sharing information in order to sort of figure out a better way of negotiating with our groups and the people who are important to us. But this begs a question. I think we want to be a little bit clear with this. What exactly is a story? And so when I'm talking about stories here, what I want to talk about is basically a way that we bundle together a set of concepts. And this is why we are natural storytellers. If you just have a bunch of information together, so say for example, I give you 15 words like this. It's not necessarily easy to process these 15 words. It'd be like reading when we used to have phone books. It'd be like reading the phone books. It's just individual pieces of information. That's not the usual way that we process information. What a story is a way of arranging that information together. It's about putting those concepts together so it's very easy for us to digest. So I can take those same words and I can say something like this. Letress Donnie paid adult film star Stormy $100,000. Now we can understand all those concepts. They work all together very, very well. And it's easy for us to remember, and it's easy for us to process. These kind of stories are the way that we make maps of reality. They provide us a legible framework for understanding what's going on around us. And we primarily do this with stories. Even when we're working with statistics, even when we're working with scientific data, ultimately what we are doing is telling stories. We're always telling stories. With statistics, we're just telling stories using numerical expressions. But we're still telling stories. Why? Because this is how we can most efficiently process information and make a map about the world. But of course, there are stories, and then there are stories with plots. If a story is just a way of arranging information, it's kind of a way of making a map of reality, a story with a plot is what is allowing us to make predictions. Because a plot is telling why something is happening. So in this case, Letress Donnie paid adult film star Stormy $100,000 to keep her quiet. Now we know why Donnie did what he did. And that gives us some indication of what Donnie might do in the future. If you want to understand your ego, you need to understand your stories. Stories are going to be the way that you make yourself intelligible. It allows you to understand what's going on. It's going to be the natural way that you process information about yourselves. So one of the things that we want to ask ourselves as we try to know ourselves is, well, what are the stories that we're telling about ourselves? And what is their plot? So let me give you an example of this. Let's take a story here. Last Saturday I went to a party, got drunk, and hooked up with some random guy. Okay, that's a story. It's just a series of concepts linked together, describes something that happened. That may tell us something about ourselves. Yeah, I went to a party, got drunk, hooked up with a random guy. But does that tell us very much? And if we want to know where we're going in the future, we want to give that story a plot. And this is where things get kind of interesting, because what is the plot of this story? Well, we might have one plot. I went to the party, got drunk, hooked up to the random guy because he was cute and sexy. And that's one story we might tell ourselves about it. Or there might be another plot there, which is, went to a party, got drunk, hooked up to the random guy because I was feeling lonely and unloved. And that's a very different kind of story we can tell about ourselves. It has a very different set of predictive elements to it. So as we go through and trying to get to know this egoistic self, how do we differentiate between these different kinds of plots that we might tell ourselves? And this is what we're going to find out. Our own plots that we oftentimes ascribe to ourselves probably aren't necessarily the most reliable descriptions of what's going on. They can be self-serving. We can delude ourselves in order to make ourselves feel better and not really tell ourselves what's going on. So, yeah, I'm going to quit drinking any day now. I just, last night was a special occasion. Or, yeah, I know he hits me, but deep down he really does love me and I'm going to stick with this relationship even though it's causing me a lot of pain. You can imagine all the stories that we tell ourselves to rationalize our own anxieties, our guilt, our dysfunctions here, and it's not serving us very well. If we want to know our egos and we want to know ourselves better, we got to get to the heart of our plots. And let me give you an example here. So one story that I think is very, very common is what, for your generation or your age group, and particularly here at the University of Chicago, is what my friend, the psychiatrist Elizabeth Keefe, calls the gold star trajectory. And this is basically one of the big narratives of your life. I think we've mentioned it before. So, you had your high school success, you got your great grades, you were in all these clubs, you marked up all the things for your college application. That was the dominant narrative probably of your high school life. And you had success and you got into the University of Chicago. That's great. And now you're here and you're competing with everyone else, and there's all this pressure because you want to go out, you want to do something better in the world, and you got to do that. In order to get that great job, you've got to do really well here. And so that's the next narrative up there. And then once you have your great job and you have your life set up, maybe you find this great spouse. And once you get your great spouse, then you find eternal happiness. And that's the gold star trajectory. And we're going to talk in a few weeks why that's such a myth and why life doesn't really work that way. But nevertheless, this is the story that we often tell about ourselves. Or I see another common story, the poor me story. Oh, I'm from such a, marginalized, underprivileged background. Everyone should give me special privileges because of that. Or I'm a miserable person. I'm not worthy of love. Why would anyone care about me? Or, I'm trodden upon here. I'm in this sort of bastion of liberalism and I can't express my own, inner thoughts or minds. Poor me, poor me, poor me. All of these are kind of narcissistic delusions, and they're stories that we wrap up around our egos that we tell ourselves that probably are not right. And remember what Nietzsche said about this last week. These are ways that we actually abnegate ourselves. These are corrosive to our own individual characters. And then finally, now, particularly with social media, we have this idea of this kind of performative bliss, where we feel compelled to sort of project out an ego image to the world. Look how great it is. Look at this wonderful sushi I'm eating. Look at me and my wonderful vacation. And what are we doing there? We're actually wanting something from other people. We're wanting some kind of acknowledgement from someone else. And it's all around this sort of performative media that's situated around this little kind of strange device here. And what's interesting about this is that this is all really weird. And by weird, what I'm going to use a term here, it's an acronym that comes from Joseph Heinrich. He's an anthropologist. And he basically describes what's particular to our modern circumstance. And weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rational, democratic. And we oftentimes think that our way of interacting with the world is kind of a natural way. It's all we know. It's all we know after all. And so it seems just self-evident that this is how people behave. But Heinrich said, this is actually really, really unusual. If you go back and look through human history, most of human history, people are not behaving this way. They are ensconced in myth. They have their place in the tribe. They don't really question what makes them happy. They don't necessarily do a lot of overt displays of their individuality. They are part of a collective whole. As I mentioned before, with modernity, and particularly in the West, we have a hyper-individualized sense of ourself. And this is it gets encapsulated in this ego. And it's this ego that is trying to figure out its place in the world without necessarily having kind of a clear location or a clear set of boundaries that's keeping it in place. And so when we're posting things online, when we're talking to our friends about what we did, we're kind of groping around to try to find what is our place. And so this is the big question I want to go back to and ask here. Did you write this story? How much are you actually responsible for the stories that you're telling about yourself? Or did you appropriate or take them from someone else? And the answer is a little bit of both, but probably more of our stories are written for us than we commonly realize. And if we want to actually have full knowledge, if we want to get to transcendence, we need to take command of writing our own stories. And this begs sort of the second big question here. Are the stories that we're using to understand our place in the world, to understand our egos, understand our relationships with other people, are these stories that are actually helping us live better? So think about that. When you sit down and you're writing, you're thinking about what I did this past weekend. Okay, I did this, I got drunk and I hooked up with that guy, and because he was sexy and cute. Or was he really sexy and cute, or was it because you were lonely and feeling unloved? And that's important to know, because is hooking up with that guy necessarily making you feel better? Maybe in the short run it was, but maybe in the long run you're like, ugh, and then you see him across campus and you're like, And the person I think who really brought this to our attention, who I want to talk about, who helps us who really first start thinking about stories and how we interpret them, is someone we already met. And this is Sigmund Freud.